and welcome to this virtual event, taking stock of COP27 and looking ahead. Thank you all for joining us this morning for this event. My name is Bob Ward. I'm the Policy and Communications Director at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment. I'm going to run through how this event's going to work. It's all virtual, so the audience have all joined us online on Zoom and can see the panelists and me. And when we get to the second half of this event, we'll be able to submit questions, written questions in the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of the screen. The chat is disabled for, you won't be able to put questions in the chat function. So please do use the Q&A function when you come to ask questions, and you will be able to vote for your upvote questions that you are, that you find particularly useful. And I will, when I come to put the questions to the panel, I will choose those that are most popular. So we have an excellent panel of people who were all at COP27 for varying amounts of time and are here to give you insights that go beyond the headlines that you may have read from the COP, which was had some highs and low points, which we will hear about. I'm going to introduce each of the panelists as they speak. They're all going to give some introductory remarks. And then after that, we will then move to the questions and answer section. This whole event is being recorded at the moment, so it will be available to be watched on the Grantham Research Institute website after this event, but it will only show the panelists, and you will be able to then watch the whole event from start to finish afterwards. So to kick us off is going to be Alison Campbell, who is the Deputy Lead Negotiator for the UK government. And we're very lucky that we've got Alison, who was there from start to finish, right to the bitter end of this, and to have joined us so soon after the end and having come back from Sharm el-Sheikh. We're very lucky to have her here. She's going to give a general overview of the negotiations and the outcomes and some thoughts on the year ahead. So without any further delay, over to you, Alison.
Thank you very much, Bob, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So thank you for having me on. Just to introduce myself, as Bob said, I'm Alison Campbell. I've been the UK's COP26 unit for the last 3 years as the Deputy COP26 envoy and then the Deputy Lead Negotiator. And my main responsibility at COP26 was to deliver the Glasgow Climate Pact. And at COP27, I was working with Archie Young, our lead negotiator, to lead the UK team in our transition back to a negotiating party for actually the first ever time in the UNFCCC. And supporting Alok Sharma as the negotiating minister. So I'll leave the experts to go in depth into specific issues and just focus on the overview and some of the dynamics that we saw out in Sharm. So it might help to start with what the UK went into COP27 aiming to deliver. So throughout our presidency year, we had been working to push forward all of the commitments made at COP26. And our objective for COP27 was very much a continuation of that. We wanted an outcome that built upon the Glasgow Climate Pact, demonstrating delivery, and then actually going further on the 4 ambition pillars across mitigation, adaptation, finance, and loss and damage. And I think it's also a word on the dynamic going into COP. So Russia's brutal war in Ukraine, the food and energy crises, the US-China relationship, the difficult G20 ministerials where we saw a lot of pushback on what was agreed last year. All of that made for a difficult context going in. So it was an important signal that over 100 leaders did show up at the beginning of COP to show that climate is still high on the political agenda. And I think that did provide some impetus, but we had always expected the negotiations to be very difficult, and they were. So in terms of the overall outcomes of COP, I'd say the headline is that some real progress was made, and I think particularly on loss and damage, which I'll go into in a bit more detail. And while we did manage to further embed the key outcomes of Glasgow, our assessment that was that we didn't make enough progress on keeping 1.5 in reach. So to dig into that a little bit more, I'll go to each of those 4 pillars in turn. And I'm going to start with loss and damage because, well, I think the outcome on this was a genuine breakthrough, and it's one that had been overdue. It was given extra impetus by the impacts we've seen throughout this year, and it will quite rightly be the thing that COP27 is remembered for. We had been hopeful going into COP that we'd be able to get into a good place because there was obviously a big push from developing countries, and it was also the first time it really felt like donors had an appetite for an agreement. And our position going into COP was that we needed an outcome on loss and damage finance. We thought a fund might be part of the answer, but it was never going to be the full answer. And what we agreed at COP was to establish funding arrangements, including a fund, by COP28. And while this is a big breakthrough, I think the real test of this will be what happens next year. So part of the outcome set up a transitional committee, which will essentially manage the process towards agreement at COP28. It's going to have to look at the various channels of funding, how they could be made more coherent, what kind of a fund would have most impact, what would the sources of finance be for such a fund, including how it could bring in a broader set of contributors. And through that, there's real potential to come out with something that delivers for the most vulnerable, which is our priority. I do think there's a risk that the transitional committee gets bogged down in negotiation politics, and I hope countries put forward experts rather than negotiators for that. I should also mention that we did make progress towards getting the Santiago network, a technical support facility, up and running, and I think that was another important outcome that was a little bit overlooked given the establishment of the fund. So those are the headlines on loss and damage. In terms of mitigation and keeping 1.5 alive, some of you might have heard Alok Sharma's closing remarks in the plenary on Sunday morning. And from that, you can probably glean that we were not happy with where we came out on that. But the critical thing was that we didn't move backwards from Glasgow, and there was some progress made. So firstly, the Glasgow Climate Pact provisions on 1.5 were repeated and firmly embedded in the outcomes. Secondly, there was a renewed call for the major emitters to revisit their NDCs by the end of the year. Again, making clear that we can't just move on to the next cycle. We have to address our 2030 ambition now. And this is important because throughout our 3 years as COP presidency, we have seen countries commit to 6 gigatons of emissions reductions per year beyond what they did in Paris. And it's not enough, as all of the reports clearly show, but it is equivalent to the annual emissions of the US. And we need to keep pushing, and we need to do more on that this year or next year. And thirdly, we agreed the modalities of the new mitigation work programme, where we'll have the opportunity to have proper discussions on the critical sectors and take yearly discussions on what needs to be done to keep 1.5 in reach. Now, the disappointing element was that the UK had been pushing along actually with a number of other countries for further political outcomes on 1.5. We wanted to see peaking by 2025. We wanted to see a commitment to follow up on the coal phase down that everybody saw was so hard fought last year. And we wanted a wider commitment on fossil fuel phase out. But the reality is that the negotiations were difficult, and some major emitters were not willing to make progress on those things, which was disappointing, particularly off the back of the G20 statement. And I think it now makes COP28 in the UAE even more pivotal in that respect. So thirdly, on adaptation, I think the big 2 outcomes on adaptation were the clear follow-up to the adaptation finance doubling through a report on progress that we'll see next year, and the commitment to explore an adaptation framework for agreement next year through the Global Goal and Adaptation Work Programme. And I think you'll hear more on this from speakers after me. But on this, I would say that there is a tendency in the UNFCCC to spend years negotiating a process just to use the time to negotiate a further process when we actually need to be getting down to the practical action needed. So I hope that that can have genuine impact next year. And finally, on finance, again, I won't comment in detail on the finance outcomes because I think you have people far more qualified on the panel to do that than me. But what I would say is that we were pleased to see the further push on the 100 billion, which clearly needs to be delivered next year. and to agree some more details on how we're going to get further down the road of negotiating the post-2025 goal. But we were also pleased to see some of the more transformative ideas coming through for how wider finance flows can align with the Paris Agreement. We have a new dialogue for discussing what Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement, which is exactly on that topic. And we started to see some of the elements of the Bridgetown agenda coming forward with a big push to transform the MDBs in particular. So they're the four big pillars. I think before I finish, it's probably just worth a word on the broader picture beyond the negotiations as well. So two further points on that. Firstly, I think it's worth highlighting the progress made on the South Africa Just Energy Transition Partnership, with the agreement of the investment plan and the new partnership just signed with Indonesia, and progress is being made with Vietnam as well. And I think this is a really promising model of how countries with different structural and societal investment in fossil fuels can be supported in the transition by donors crowding in behind country level led plans. And the second thing is there is this sense of continued momentum on the wider collaboration piece. So we held a number of events through COP27 to take forward some of the initiatives we launched at COP26 on the breakthrough agenda on coal, on zero emission vehicles, and we had the leader level launch of the Forest and Climate Leaders Partnership. And I think the high level champions have also been really active in continuing their good work to corral non-state actors to deliver on the Paris goals and to deliver net zero by 2050. So in terms of what this all means for next year, it's the global stocktake year where we need to not only assess our progress towards the Paris goals, but we need to set out a response to the gaps that we know are there. We will be pushing for a lot more to keep 1.5 in reach, to make sure finance is flowing at a suitable scale. And we'll also need to put a lot of work into agreeing the funding arrangements for loss and damage, as I mentioned earlier. And I think overall, we really hope we can shift into an improved dynamic with major emitters really taking responsibility. So those are going to be our priorities next year, but I'll maybe stop there, Bob, and hand back to you. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Alison. That's an excellent overview, very quick introduction to the key points from the outcome, and some signals of what the major issues are going to be in the year ahead to COP28 in Dubai. If you have questions for Alison, please put them in the Q&A. You can use the Q&A at any time, and we will put those questions to Alison at the in the second half. So thank you, Alison. So we're going to move next to Timo Leiter, who is a PhD student here at the Grantham Research Institute, but more importantly was a lead author on the adaptation gap report that was prepared by published by the United Nations Environment Programme earlier this year. So Timo's going to talk primarily about the adaptation negotiations and outcomes. So Timo, who as you can see has got some slides and is going to rattle through them. So over to you, Timo.
Thanks, Bob, and thank you very much, Alison, for your overview of the COP. I'm focusing on adaptation. Interestingly, adaptation was the key topic last year, ending as the top topic in the cover decision, and this year was completely overshadowed by loss and damage. But this doesn't mean that adaptation didn't take place. I'm going to run you very briefly through the items where adaptation featured, and most importantly, focusing on the work program on the global goal on adaptation, as Alison mentioned. So on this slide, very briefly, so there's Article 7 in the Paris Agreement on adaptation, which has established a global goal on adaptation, which encourages countries to plan for adaptation and implement it, including through national adaptation plans. And there are provisions for reporting in this article and under the transparency article. And we had corresponding agenda items at the COP in Sharm el-Sheikh. And in addition to those main items, there were a few other aspects where there is the Adaptation Committee, the body under the convention dealing with adaptation, LDC matters, and as Alison mentioned, adaptation finance. So on the following slide, I'm going to show you what the main outcomes have been on each of those, before then focusing on the work program on the global goal on adaptation. Starting with the doubling of adaptation finance, which was one of the key agreements on adaptation last year in Glasgow, doubling adaptation finance from 20 billion to 40 billion. It was suggested at the outset of COP27 to have a standalone agenda item on this topic. There was also support from the UN Secretary General for coming up with a roadmap and milestones on how to achieve and by when to achieve this doubling. However, there was no agreement to include this on the agenda as an independent item. At the same time, so this proposal was made by the G77. At the same time, the proposal by Western countries to have an agenda item on 1.5 was also not agreed. So the main outcome on this has been, as Alison mentioned, a report which the Standing Committee on Finance is to prepare by the next COP on this doubling. On national adaptation plans and LEC matters, these two items are quite similar in their content. The key demand from developing countries is finance for the implementation of NAPs, because more and more developing countries have those NAPs. There was an agreement to have additional guidance on the implementation of NAPs and a request for funding for NAP implementation to the GCF. This was agreed under the finance negotiator item GCF guidance. And then there were two more items. One is actually quite surprising. It's called very technically voluntary review of adaptation information in the biannual transparency report. The interesting part is that in the Paris Agreement, it was actually not foreseen for countries to have the information they report on adaptation reviewed at all. And this is now possible. And on the adaptation committee, there was no agreement that could be reached on the review of the functions and processes of the adaptation committee. So lots of technical things, but it's coming to the exciting bit, which is the actual work program on the global goal on adaptation. Again, brief context here. The Paris Agreement established in Article 7.1 the global goal on adaptation, which has the components you see here: enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, reducing vulnerability in the context of the temperature goal. And the global stocktake is to take progress towards achieving this goal. Now, adaptation is very different from mitigation, so therefore this goal is qualitative in nature. It does not have quantitative specifications. And so the key mechanism, nevertheless, under the Paris Agreement, the NDCs can cover mitigation and adaptation. But developing countries have keep pushing for more on adaptation. And so last year in Glasgow, one of the main decisions was to have this 2-year work program on the global goal, which has many different objectives. We had workshops across the year. And so basically it's now half time of this work program. So let's have a look at what was decided. The main debates under this item were whether the global goal should be further specified or not, keeping in mind also that for mitigation for the 2-degree goal and the 1.5-degree goal, there is no further work plan or specification. Another question would be, if so, then if there should be sub-goals, if there should be a framework or indicators, what role the IPCC might take, and what the relation to the global stocktake is. So these were all questions discussed throughout the year and now in Sharm el-Sheikh. There was a huge debate whether there should be a framework or not, and the conclusion in the end was initiating the development of a framework by COP28. So such a framework will be developed. The decision lists certain things that could be considered. Countries are invited for submissions, and the IPCC is invited to update its guidance, which it had in 1994 on impact assessment. So this doesn't sound overly exciting. Where does this leave us and how should we reflect on this? Is this progress or not? Well, importantly, adaptation, as mentioned, is quite different from mitigation, and we cannot simply measure the ambition by adding up greenhouse gases. So having a framework is not necessarily progress unless the framework would really be meaningful and helpful. And having indicators themselves, if these would be highly simplistic indicators like number of countries with a plan, wouldn't necessarily move us forward. So it's not easy to have a judgment on the outcomes of this COP in terms of adaptation, but crucial work lies ahead, and the next year will be decisive to get to a framework that's actually useful and able to facilitate enhanced adaptation. And as a further reading, I would also like to refer you to the IPCC chapter 17 in Working Group 2, which has a box on assessing global adaptation progress and the adaptation gap report, of which I'm one of the lead authors, which is also taking stock of adaptation. I have a final slide, which is reflecting on the role of the presidency now, as I experienced, because I was in the room in all these adaptation negotiations, and it was quite different to all the previous COPs I have experienced. So on this item on the GGA work program, we only had one single iteration until Wednesday of week 2. Usually you would have at least 3 iterations by Saturday of week 1. The iteration that was there was very limited and included basically the G77 proposal or nothing. So only the 2 extreme options. So many groups, including AOSIS, ILEC, DEU, said that their positions was not reflected. Very interestingly, on this agenda item, it was not, as you often have in finance, developing countries versus developed countries, but it was basically the African group of negotiators and a few others against everyone else. The facilitators were basically forced to have a new text, which came very, very late. Again, I've never experienced this in the 12 negotiation sessions I've participated in. The ministerial facilitation took place the second half of week 2. However, the presidency changed the text after the ministerial facilitation, which was interesting. And then when it came to the cover decision on Saturday, there were suddenly 2 paragraphs in the cover decision, which stated something that was never discussed in the room on the global goal, namely implying that the global goal would be unclear and should be replaced, which would have implied renegotiating the Paris Agreement. These paragraphs caused quite some confusion. They were replaced, but yeah, so this is just leaving you with some of the observations of the role of the presidency. And as mentioned, the next year will be really key. And by COP28, we can see if the adaptation framework will hopefully move us forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Timo, for that a very detailed focus on adaptation based on obviously your first-hand experience of going through the negotiation process and pointed to some of the challenges that arose. I think you can stop sharing your screen now, and then we can kind of move on. So again, if you have a question for Timo about his comments, particularly on adaptation, then please put it in the Q&A now, and we're going to move on to our next panelist, Nicholas Stern, who's going to talk about finance, and rather than the details of the finance negotiations, he'll talk about an initiative and a major report that was published in the first week. So Nick, over to you.
Thanks very much, Bob, and thank you to Alison and Timo for very thoughtful and helpful discussions of the negotiating process. I want to talk about things that happened outside the negotiating process, particularly finance, but a couple of things I'd like to raise just before I do that. But I would like to recognize the fantastic leadership of Alok Sharma, Peter Hill, Archie Young, and Alison, and all the team. I think looking back, I've been at all the COPs since 2006. I think that was COP12. And I do think that COP26 in the history of all these things will absolutely stand out. And their work over this last year to take COP26 forward, or at least stop it going backwards, I think has been enormously important and indeed effective under pressures which we ought to be discussing on some other occasion. But they may well be there in the coming year as well. So there are about 40,000. I don't know what the right number is, but it was ballpark similar in COP27 and COP26. And it has now become the place where you go to discuss hard, difficult, important, practical, and strategic questions across a whole range of subjects. And that's very good. The private sector was there in force, all kinds of detail of the deals that they were doing, and not just the deals, looking at the circumstances under which investment can advance and its finance can advance. Technology, you had the offshore, just some examples, but they're important. The offshore wind alliance, the green shipping hub. It's a bit like, where to charge your electric vehicle if you're driving to Glasgow. And the carbon capture use and storage, where particularly direct air capture the costs are high, but coming down very rapidly, and exploring the prospects for that. So these are just three very important examples of areas where technology and associated investment was very important. The country story has already been mentioned. Of course, Indonesia, very important, South Africa, but also India. And we were there as we were asked to attend the launch of India's long-term strategy, which starts to give real substance to Prime Minister Modi's landmark speech at Glasgow, and how they're actually going to move forward. All these things I've just mentioned are very big. The global shield on adaptation, an important insurance story. The fact that China and US have resumed now official contacts around climate. Lots of young people, lots more young people there than in the past, which is wonderful. And all the MDB presidencies, or with one or two exceptions, were all there, and they feel now that they have to be there. We had the Coalition of Finance Ministers, which Grantham has done so much to support and put together. If you compare the turnout of the Coalition of Finance Ministers here relative to Madrid just 3 years ago, it was a huge, huge difference. So on all these fronts, we've seen very strong move forward. Now, let me talk to the finance issue and the Songwei Stern Bhattacharya report. Essentially, we were asked by the two COP presidencies to look at what climate finance, particularly to emerging markets, developing economies, excluding China. China, of course, extremely important, but they don't need external climate finance. We were asked to look at that by the two COP presidencies and the two climate champions. And the way we looked at it said, well, the key at the heart of all this story of delivering on Paris, delivering the low carbon economy, delivering the new form of development, the much more attractive growth story that we have in our hands, is about investment. So we looked at the investment necessary for delivery on Paris under three broad headings: the energy transition, a whole set of questions around adaptation, resilience, loss and damage, and so on. And then thirdly, natural capital. We suggested, and this was long-standing work from Brookings and the Grantham Institute, on what sorts of investments are necessary. Flows of investments around 2.4 trillion into the emerging markets, developing economies, into their economies, not external investment. The total flow of investment in those economies should be around 2.4 trillion a year by 2030. 1.4 trillion roughly for the energy transition, and roughly 1 trillion for adaptation, resilience, loss and damage, and natural capital, with that 1 trillion split roughly one third across adaptation, resilience, loss and damage, and natural capital. Much of investment around the world, indeed the big majority of investment around the world, is financed internally through the public and private flows of funds. But of course, for many emerging markets and developing economies, that's hard. Others, like India, the big majority, would be financed internally. So we concluded that roughly 1 trillion would need to be coming from external finance, which would be ballpark 55% private, 25% MDBs, 20% from a mixture of sources, which would be direct bilateral support, SDRs, philanthropy, voluntary carbon markets, some of the more creative guarantee mechanisms like IFED and so on. So that was, broadly speaking, the story of climate finance. It's deduced, it's not negotiated like the 100 billion. I was there for negotiations, 100 billion, was very much involved in Copenhagen in 2009. This is deduced from the investments necessary to deliver on Paris. So that's what we have tried to offer. I can't go into the detail, it's all available on our website. But the challenge then is to look at the finance as a whole. And one of the problems with COPs, they've looked at a bit. They've looked at loss and damage. They've looked at the very good Bridgetown initiative, which is largely around managing risk of extreme events. But you have to look at the thing as a whole. The bits and pieces don't really cut the mustard. You've got of delivering on Paris. You've got to look at it as a whole. And that story we described is totally feasible. It would be bumping up investment levels very significantly, but in many countries back to levels that they have been in the past. In a world where you've got planned saving, in excess of planned investment, the answer is to increase investment from a world macro point of view. So all this is perfectly possible. It would involve a tripling of the flows of funds from the MDBs into emerging markets, developing economies over the next 5 years. That is the way to start the analysis of the reform of the MDBs. All too often people dive into reform of the MDBs by observing quite correctly, although somewhat with some banality, that the structure of the world economy has changed since 1944. Certainly has, when the Bretton Woods institutions were founded, but this is reform for a purpose. What purpose? It's delivery on Paris. And we must be very clear, and it's very important when we think of adaptation and resilience as well, that so much of this is about a new growth model. And adaptation and resilience, mitigation and development are all wound up together. We make a logical mistake and a practical mistake and a political mistake if we try to pull them apart too energetically. There's some cases where you get pure adaptation, think of the seawall, yeah, but very much of the story, think of mangroves, think of public transport, decentralized solar, restoring degraded land, our forests, wherever you look, mitigation, adaptation, resilience, and development all bound up together. This is a development story. And one of the good things, I think, over the discussions in the COPs over the years is that understanding that this is a new and much more attractive form of development is deeper and deeper. We wouldn't have got Paris without the beginnings of that understanding. And one of the more positive outcomes, I think, is people are now seeing very clearly this as a new development story, whether you look at South Africa, Vietnam, Indonesia, and particularly, I think, India, which is of great importance because of the G20 presidency of India coming up, in which we at the Grantham will be very deeply involved. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Nick, for that insight on the, particularly the details around the report. The report is, Nick is co-chair with Vera Songway of the high-level expert group on climate finance. As Nick mentioned, it was commissioned by the COP26 and COP27 presidencies and the UN climate change champions, and you can find that report on the Grantham Research Institute website. Very good. So if you have a question for Nick, please put it in the Q&A. We're now going to move on to the next speaker, Nick Robbins, who's going to also talk about finance, but a different aspect of it, and particularly around the just transition as well as the global stocktake, I think. So over to you, Nick.
Thanks very much, Bob, and thanks to Alison and Nick and Timo for giving their presentations. I'll try to add to that. So my name is Nick Robbins. I'm a professor in practice for sustainable finance at the LSE Grantham Research Institute. And I was at COP in sort of two roles. One, to take part in the Global Stocktakes second technical dialogue as an expert, particularly to focus on this whole issue of aligning financial flows with net zero and resilient developments, the Article 21C of the Paris Agreement, and also there to advance the agenda around just transition finance, notably through a partnership between the ILO and the LSE and the release of a new just transition finance tool. So my personal takeaways will focusing on these interlocking priorities of finance and just transition, as well as a couple of other observations. We've heard about the real progress in terms of the loss and damage fund after 30 years of pressure from developing countries, and clearly the key is to make sure that this is not a fund in name only. I think, as Nick has just highlighted, there was a real recognition that the current global financial architecture is not fit for purpose, expressed most clearly by Barbados Prime Minister Motley, but also echoed by many leaders, political leaders, but also financial sector leaders. What struck me was that this agenda of financial system reform was reflected in the Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan agreed by governments, who identified that we need a transformation of the financial system and its structures and processes. Very clear language there, and that this is needed to mobilize the $46 trillion in an annual investment, which is needed just for net zero alone. The Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan identifies that this is going to mean engaging with governments, with central banks, with commercial banks, with institutional investors and others. And I think this implementation plan agreed at COP27 is the first time that central banks have been included in a COP decision, really highlighting the importance or role of these guardians of the financial system, both in reducing climate risks, but also in scaling up climate finance. And I think pointing to the key role that groups such as the NGFS, the Network for Greening the Financial System, and its 100+ members can play in the year ahead. Nick has already pointed to the Coalition of Finance Ministers and all the meetings I was in. The pivotal role of finance ministers in achieving this realignment of capital was stressed repeatedly. And the coalition, now with 79 members, issued a new consultation, very useful document setting out the role of finance ministers across strategy, across investment planning, fiscal policy, and then the raising, steering and blending of finance for a just transition. Finally, on the broad theme of finance, I just wanted to pick up on the results of the net zero high-level expert group commissioned by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres and led by the former Environment Minister of Canada, Catherine McKenna. The report, called Integrity Matters, really sets a clear standard on what net zero by non-state actors, particularly business, finance and cities, what this means in terms of targets, in terms of transition plans, in terms of phasing out fossil fuels and scaling up renewables, the limited role that the offsets can play, the importance of nature and the imperative of just transition in net zero plans. So I just want to turn then to just transition itself. For those of you who remember the Paris Agreement, the just transition merited just a single sentence in 2015 in the Paris Agreement. But at Sharm el-Sheikh, it really was a framing concept for enabling the implementation of climate ambition, which was highlighted by governments from North and South, by trade unions, by business, by finance, and by civil society. And this was reflected in the Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan again, which has established a new work program on the just transition, highlighting the importance of meaningful and effective social dialogue and participation by all stakeholders, as well as social protection. There'll now be an annual high-level ministerial on just transition within the UNFCCC. This importance of the just transition was really given substance at the national level by South Africa's President Ramaphosa, who presented his country's 5-year 98 billion just energy transition investment plan, which also included an initial 8.5 billion in international support from France, Germany, the UK and the US, as well as the EU. And importantly, this plan is designed to deliver South Africa's decarbonisation to keep the world on a 1.5 degree pathway, and to do so while promoting sustainable development and ensuring a just transition for affected workers and communities. Indonesia's President Widodo also launched his country's Just Energy Transition Partnership at the G20 summit around the same time as COP, with 20 billion of international climate finance, split 50-50 between public and private sector flows. The Egyptian government also released its own Sharm el-Sheikh guidebook for just financing to accelerate equitable financing flows into developing countries and leaving no one behind. So this prominence of the just transition, I think, is a real step forward. But I think there also was some concern that it could become an empty phrase. And that means making sure that the ILO's just transition guidelines are applied, notably around the respect for core labour standards and human rights, including gender equality, and the involvement of workers and communities in the process of transformation. That's why we were so pleased at the Grantham Research Institute to launch our Just Transition Finance tool with the ILO, showing in practical terms how the just transition can be supported with integrity and with impact by banks and investors. A couple of points, if I may, just on the whole theme around forests and nature. Alison mentioned the Leaders Summit segment on forests, which I attended. And I think as a theme, the importance of forest and nature really is rising up the agenda, but both with a mix of optimism and I think of sadness. Certainly the most exciting moment of COP27 was the speech by Brazil's President-elect Lula da Silva, who made clear that Brazil is back and he will work to deliver zero forestation in Brazil and partner with key rainforest nations such as the Congo and Indonesia. But there was also one of the saddest moments when Norway's Prime Minister Støre at the Climate and Forest Leaders Summit asked everybody to stand to acknowledge the journalists, the environmental and human rights defenders who pay with their lives to protect nature and their communities. Indigenous peoples at COP also frequently express their fear at the coming impact on their lives and their lands of the expansion of transition minerals, highlighting the importance of ensuring that any growth in minerals we need for net zero is done within the framework of human rights and the rights of Indigenous people. More broadly, at COP itself, the failure by the Egyptian government to release the British citizen and democracy leader Alaa Abdel Fattah was a low moment, I think. It underscored the intrinsic links between climate justice and human rights, and I hope he'll be free soon to be with his family. Just looking ahead, taking forward some of these themes, clearly completing the global stocktake next year will be crucial to be a foundation for a real shift in action heading into COP28 on net zero, adaptation, loss and damage, and finance. This theme of financial transformation will be really key to work out a roadmap for this with finance ministers, central banks, international financial institutions, as well as banks, investors, and insurers. A number of summits next year will be key to take that forward. On fossil fuels, I think it'd be good to pick up India's proposal to extend the phase down of fossil fuels, which was focused on coal in the Glasgow Pact, to include oil and gas. On forests, obviously looking to Brazil and other rainforest nations to take the lead in ending deforestation. On net zero, translating the recommendations of Catherine McKenna's net zero view into market practice and financial regulation will be key, including in the work of the UK's Transition Plan Task Force. And then just transition, I think ensuring that there's a high integrity, high impact just transition work program will be key. And that will mean how we measure progress at all levels. Important to see business and finance, their net zero plans with just transition inside, and then more just transition partnerships led by developing countries concerned to deliver real impact on the ground. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Nick, for those. That's a very good summary of a variety of issues relating to the finance discussions and beyond that took place, and flagging up some of the key issues in the year ahead. And again, flagging up that there were recognitions at COP27, although not as perhaps as many as we need, of a link between the negotiation process and what is actually happening in the outside world. There are times when it feels like the COP negotiations feel a little bit inward facing instead of outward facing. Anyway, if you have a question for Nick Robbins, please put it into the Q&A, and we'll move on now to Alina Averchenkova, who's going to talk about governance and the COP process.
Hello, everyone. I think 1 year ago when we met here for the post-COP event discussing outcomes of Glasgow, one outcome which made us very optimistic was the growing commitment by countries to net zero targets. I think coming out of COP26, we noted that 90% of the world's GDP was actually covered by countries that put forward net zero targets during or leading up to Glasgow summit. Sadly, coming up to COP27, when we look at the implementation, and I think as one of the participants noted in the question and answer chat, this COP was actually branded as the implementation COP. Very worrying numbers came from the UN emission gap report just before the COP, saying that very little progress has been made towards implementation of the NDCs and the net zero targets. And their assessment was that if the implementation of all NDCs and net zero commitments would be achieved, we could hope for 1.8 degree temperature increase. However, they felt that this scenario was not credible given the current emissions and also the progress with implementation of those targets. So this was very much the context with which side discussions at the COP on the governance and national implementation arrangements were taking place. And there were particularly 3 themes that one could structure some of those discussions. One is how to integrate objectives into the national frameworks so that to protect them against political change over time. And the case of Brazil, I think, as Nick was mentioning, was one of the highlights of this COP. Political change that actually is expected to lead to more ambitious climate policy, but oftentimes that's not the case. The second theme was how to put in place national frameworks that actually sustain political commitment and enable implementation that is backed up by strong citizens buy-in and effective infrastructure. And I'll talk more about each of those. And the final theme, which I think already colleagues talking about finance mentioned, is how do we ensure accountability for implementation and the integrity around actually meeting the promises that different actors are putting forward. So on the first theme, in terms of integrating objectives and protecting them over political change, much of the discussion was about progress with putting in place and implementing climate legislation. If we look at the progress over the last year, at the moment, we only have roughly 20 countries which have already integrated their net zero targets into national legal frameworks, climate laws, and quite a bit more countries which have introduced them into the executive climate policies. And some of the highlights which were discussed this year is, of course, climate legislation adopted by Australia, Chile, Portugal, Colombia, Nigeria, all of which includes net zero targets. And those experiences were highlighted at the COP. We at the Grantham Research Institute, in partnership with colleagues in South Africa and India and with Interparliamentary Union, hosted a discussion on how can climate laws be adapted to the local context and national context of countries and different political regimes. And that discussion featured experiences from South Africa, Zimbabwe, US, Peru, and India. Another theme which I mentioned is how to develop national climate governance infrastructure to ensure that climate goals can actually be implemented effectively, particularly through mainstreaming climate change into the different sectoral programs and strategies, and also to develop national infrastructure that allows to raise finance. And one of the highlights which Nick Stern briefly mentioned was the discussions around the role of the Ministry of Finance, around the coalition of the Ministries of Finance. And here our institute, the team of the institute has prepared a draft report which rethinks the role of the Minister of Finance and the Ministry of Finance in the context of climate action. So we have provided input for the ministerial discussions, and the draft report is currently going for consultation, which effectively proposes the framework for scaling action on behalf of the Ministries of Finance, which are at the center of planning, economic planning, and fiscal strategy in the countries around the world. And the report looks at transformative actions, both in terms of where does ministry fit in the context of climate governance, how it relates to other ministries in the country, but also how ministry can develop its own capabilities internally to address climate change. And that work is based on case studies from all around the world. So that was very exciting development. The second stream, alongside enabling effective implementation, was very strong attention to the issue of public participation and the recognition across the board from different regions, different types of countries and communities, that unless we bring the society with us and get the buy-in for the political objectives of addressing climate change, we won't be able to actually carry out with the transformation. And in those discussions, particular themes were importance of gender equality and participation in the context of developing and implementing climate policy, inclusion of indigenous knowledge and perspectives, and addressing that, including through legal frameworks. There's some very interesting examples where countries are already introducing formal provisions for including indigenous populations and indigenous knowledge into their climate laws and policies. And overall importance of approaching public participation beyond just being a tick box exercise. And in this context, there were very exciting events talking about new instruments such as deliberative democracy and citizens' assemblies on climate change, which are taking place particularly in Europe, but also increasingly in other regions of the world, and how they could be used to provide that mechanism for citizens to be actively engaged in shaping climate policy and implementing it. And finally, the topic of integrity and accountability, a big one at this COP, I think bigger than the other governance themes, I would dare say, from my personal impression. And I think the report that Nick mentioned by the high-level expert group on net zero emission commitments by non-state entities and the focus on avoiding greenwashing was one important driver for that. And so we had a lot of events looking at the role of litigation in particular in ensuring implementation of climate objectives. And interesting in the context of loss and damage discussion in particular, climate litigation, of course, has already been playing this compensation role for a number of years. We have several examples of climate litigation cases. For example, a Peruvian farmer, Saul Luciano, against RWE, asking WRE to contribute for flood risk reduction measures. There is also a case seeking for Holcim to pay for loss and damage already suffered by 4 islanders of Pari. So all of these ongoing cases, they were discussed at this COP, and there is a feeling that they might create a powerful precedent on how litigation can actually play a role in loss and damage. But beyond that, there was also a lot of attention to how litigation more generally as a tool can help drive both strategic cases which address ambition by states, but also cases that address compliance and accountability for objectives set. So in a sense, how can litigation play a stronger role in ensuring implementation? Looking ahead, I think very much these are the themes in my mind which will be at the forefront of the governance debate this year. Firstly, how can we get more countries adopt credible legal frameworks at the national level to ensure implementation of net zero climate resilience objectives? How can we strengthen various features of governance infrastructure, including provisions for accountability, provision for independent expert advice, similar to what UK and many other countries have, like the UK's Climate Change Committee, public participation and regulatory frameworks, and also business standards for greenwashing. I think that is becoming a stronger area of focus for this year, both based on the advice from the UN high-level expert group, but also based on understanding by national governments that there needs to be a stronger and greater clarity on how commitments and actions by non-state actors would be integrated into the national frameworks in the context of national commitments as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Alina, covering the important issue of how to translate agreements at COPs into action domestically, particularly through legislation and litigation and all the issues associated with that. Now, a lot of very important discussions going on at the COP around the negotiations on that issue. So we come to our final panelist, Mara Gillen. I should have mentioned actually, Alina is Distinguished Policy Fellow at the Grantham Research Institute. Mara Gillen, now who attended COP as a Global Youth Ambassador for the Global Alliance of Universities on Climate. I think it was your first COP, wasn't it? Hopefully not your last, but we'll see what you say about it. And so it's very good to hear from you with fresh eyes, your impressions of the COP as a Global Youth Ambassador and what it was like. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Bob. Yes, my name is Mara Gillen. I am a Global Youth Ambassador for the Global Alliance of Universities on Climate, and also an MSc Global Politics candidate at LSE. And I feel deeply honored to have the opportunity to speak today among these amazing panelists, and also to have been given the opportunity to participate at COP27 with the full support of LSE. It's remarkable that LSE did include a young delegate in the delegation, and I'm proud that my university is walking the talk. First of all, I want to talk about what GAUK is and what my work there as a youth ambassador has been, and secondly, more broadly, about the youth climate movement. First of all, the Global Alliance of Universities on Climate is an alliance of 15 universities, including LSE. I'm not going to name them. It is global, and I assure you that we're in good company. We are at the intersection of being a network of universities focused on research, and also a youth network that focuses on capacity building. And that's how I actually became a global youth ambassador, through a leadership program that empowered me, that helped me develop very important skills, and also to access the incredible GAUK platform. And thanks to the work that I've been doing throughout the summer, during the course of the program, I've been invited to participate, to be a member of the GAUK delegation at COP27. And it's been an intense experience. I recommend it to any other young person at LSE looking to get more involved. In the first half an hour since I arrived at the hotel, I was already preparing a press conference for the second day, and that is not a normal day for me. And so it's been truly exceptional. I think our work had two high points. First of all, GAUK Day, which was a day full of events, and I'm proud to say that people from the Grantham Research Institute, including Lord Stern, Bob, Ward, Danae Kyriakopoulou, were there, among many other participants from our member universities, also ministers of the environment from France, from China, and many high-level participants who attended the entire day, participated in our events, and hopefully listened to our message. Coming to our message, it's been delivered in an open letter to world leaders that we have been tirelessly pushing throughout the entire COP. Luckily, it has reached some important figures, such as Emmanuel Macron, such as the president of COP27, several presidents, ministers of foreign affairs, and ministers of the environment. And I was very happy to also receive the reply of President Macron during GAUK Day from the Minister of the Environment from France. So in short, what we're asking for in this open letter, we're asking for world leaders to commit to the principle of intergenerational justice. And that takes three directions. First of all, by translating the long-term zero carbon commitments into strengthened actions for the well-being of our generation and the generations to come. Secondly, by broadening the channels for young people to participate effectively in climate governance. This can take the form of having youth delegates in the national delegations. It can take the form of actually taking into consideration the messages that young people are tirelessly sending. And thirdly, by providing more platforms and opportunities to empower the global youth through capacity building, thus mobilizing the youth from all over the world to shape our collective future. And in this sense, we're looking forward to more training programs, employment opportunities, and local engagement. Secondly, moving towards the youth climate movement in general and its presence at COP27. There are both good things and bad things. I'm going to start with the bad because the good is much more to talk about. It's very important to acknowledge how difficult it has been for young people to participate in this year's COP. Out of my colleagues, almost no one made it there. I'm very proud to have made it there with the support of LSE, but it's been really difficult to obtain accreditation and funding for any young person trying to attend that hasn't been a part of a national delegation. On the other hand, youth participation, as Lord Stern said, has been really visible at this COP. We had the first ever Children and Youth Pavilion, and I think everyone who was there can attest to the fact that it was the liveliest place in the entire venue. I think only President Lula could generate that kind of commotion at the venue. So we were really vocal and really present, and not without good use. Young people, young activists stayed there until the final stages of the negotiation. They contacted the delegates of the main blockers, and they pushed forward our messages. And this is reflected in the fact that in the decision in Articles 93 to 95, the importance of youth participation and youth empowerment is acknowledged, as well as the importance of recalling the principle of intergenerational justice. And finally, I want to send a message to other young people watching now. First of all, to get involved. If you're a member of one of the GAUK universities, I fully recommend registering, applying to the leadership program. That's what brought me here in the first place. And to get involved in as many ways as possible. I think we're all struggling to understand why whether our voices deserve to be heard, and they do. I want to assure you that they do, because we have genuine understanding of the existential nature of climate crisis. We are capable, young people, looking at the definition of what youth is, between, let's say, 15 to 35 years old, even if we use a conservative one, up to 30, there are young people who have a decade of experience in their own field, and they are well educated, they are well skilled, and they do deserve to be treated as key stakeholders, not as voices that can be listened to when and if convenient. And to not have confidence in oneself in this sense almost seems like giving in and being an accomplice to not taking young people seriously. I also want to share a bit of what came out of this for me. I am currently working towards setting up the Romanian Youth Climate Council, and also working on a global campaign on stopping youth washing, a term that we have defined during a workshop at COP. These are things that I wouldn't have thought of when I was on my way to COP27, but they're resulted from the energy and the honest commitment that the people that I've met there have towards climate action. So yeah, my message is as simple as just believe in yourself and put in the work. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mara, for that perspective. And there were 46,000 delegates total registered for the event, so that was more than in Glasgow, and there were a lot of younger people there. I think, as Mara said, having spoken to some of them, that they were a bit frustrated that they were there, but didn't feel that how they could get involved in the negotiations. The negotiations are, of course, government negotiations. But of course, young people are going to live with the consequences of these COPs for far longer than older generations, and how to understand and involve the perspective and engage that perspective, I think remains a challenge. So thank you, Mara. We're going to move straight on to the Q&A. If you have a burning question for any of our panelists, please put it in the Q&A now, and we're going to move straight on. And remember to vote for your favorite one. So we'll go straight to the number one question on the list, which is from Jeff Kendall. Do any of the panelists have reason to believe that the COP process can yet deliver what's needed for us to stay within 1.5 degrees? And if not, would it be better to confront that fact head on? So a very, very strong question. And I think a question that everybody asks after these COPs, you know, they are consensus processes between more than 190 countries. People often ask, why are they so slow? I often think, how is it that anything gets decided at those? But perhaps, Alison, can I put that question first to you? Sure.
Yeah, and as you say, good question, and a one that's commonly asked. So, I mean, my answer to that is that the COP process it's necessary but not sufficient to deliver on 1.5. So, I think the COP process can have a huge impact. You know, we saw through Paris and what it's done, you know, on aligning financial flows, on country commitments coming forward, and we would like to think in Glasgow really enshrining that we do need to deliver 1.5 degrees and all of the steps that need to be taken towards that. So I think, you know, there are three broad things it can do. It can send the political signals and set the high level targets. It can ensure accountability of those targets, and at least we know when they're not being met. And it can support countries to implement those targets. But and I think that's critical, but it can't do everything, and it needs the wider ecosystem around it and all of the things that Professor Stern was talking about as well. So it's kind of a circular question in some ways, but my view is that the COP process is a vital part of it, and particularly because it brings in the voices of the most. It's really the only place, you know, where the small island states get to sit around the table with some of the G20 emitters, and in my view, that's kind of the biggest value of the process.
Thank you, Alison. Anybody, any of the other panelists want to offer a view on this? Nick Stern?
Yeah, thank you, Jeff, for the question. We deliver on net zero 1.5 or not, depending on investment. This is an investment story, and the investments are driven by the realization of, or the expected realization of profits in relation to the risk. So it's the job of governments, and COP is enormously important in this, to set the environment in which that investment can take place. Most of it will be private, key parts of it, crucial parts of it will be public. So if you ask about delivery, you're asking about investment and the innovation necessary to deliver, and then very quickly the finance for that investment, the policies, the institutional structures which can enable that investment. So the question of how useful the COP is in delivery has to be seen through that investment process. And if you look back at Paris, which was the Paris and Glasgow, if you like, landmark COPs, although Cancun in 2010 following Copenhagen was very important too. What they did is to chart the future for those who are thinking about making investments. And it changed what happened. If you look now at emissions, probably probably a quarter to a third are in areas where the clean is already cheaper than the dirty, even without a carbon price and subsidy. That came about through the sense of direction. It didn't come about through brilliant policies in all countries. It came about through the sense of direction and policies in the countries which were at least moving, and the institutional structures at least moving in a good direction. So I think that's the way to put it. I think Alison's description of necessary and sufficient is absolutely right. But if we're asking about what's sufficient, we have to look at it from the perspective of investment. But this simply couldn't have happened without the UNFCCC processes.
Thank you, Nick. Any of the other, Nick Robbins, yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Maybe building on that, I mean, certainly in the global stocktake, which was actually a very open process with roundtables, World Cafe, and so on, it really struck me that the COP process is absolutely essential. I think, as Alison's saying, particularly to ensure wide participation, particularly developing countries. And the key for progress is to ensure that it's connected with what is happening in the real world, which is why I think that particular recognition in the Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan about transformation of financial system is so important, because that's going to send signals, as Nick has highlighted, to investors, to central banks, to finance ministers. And if we have that dynamic between this process and the real world, and make that work very powerfully, then I think we can make progress.
Thank you, Nick. Anybody else? Oh, we'll move on to the next question. Thank you, Jeff, for that question. And of course, I mean, it is worth stating that the collective NDCs at the moment are nowhere near being consistent with the path that would keep us below 1.5. So at the moment, we're on an overshoot pathway. And I think it is worth us kind of focusing people's minds and for subsequent COPs, including in Dubai. So we're going to move on to a question from Heidi Zamzow, who's a PhD student at LSE. She says, animal agriculture is a major driver of climate change, ocean acidification, biodiversity loss, and degradation of natural resources. Meat and dairy consumption in industrialized nations is primarily responsible, but the demand for animal products is also increasing in the developed world. When is the COP going to put food on the negotiation table? Now, I know there was a lot of discussion about food, certainly in the side events, but I'm not sure how it featured in the negotiation process. So I'm wondering, again, Alison, perhaps I could start with you, just asking where you saw food being discussed as part of the negotiation process.
Yeah, sure. So it is part of the negotiating process. It's just not, I think, at the level of the political signals that the question implies. So there is it's called the Coronovia work program, and that does deal with food and agriculture. And they were actually quite intensive negotiations this year. They lasted for the whole 2 weeks, and they agreed a new 4-year joint work program on implementation and climate action in agriculture and food security. A lot of the framing of that, more so than we've seen previously, was around that food security issue and you know, the recognition that the resilience of food systems just is not there at the moment with the multiple crises that we have facing us. So I would say it's much more geared towards that, and then the steps that can be taken practically to mitigate and adapt through agriculture. I would agree that that bigger political question of consumption doesn't come through as much. I think there are, you know, obvious reasons for that. That there's in the cover decision, and there was a nod, I think, to sustainable consumption patterns, which is very vague and opaque. But it's, I mean, I think it's just something that isn't negotiated and probably couldn't be negotiated. I think it's a bigger political question that has to be addressed. And a lot of countries would say that, you know, agriculture is part of their NDCs if they have an economy-wide target, and it should be addressed through that kind of nationally determined nature rather than negotiated. So I think that's broadly where we are on that question.
Thank you very much, Alina, and then Nick Stern.
I fully agree with what Alison has just said, and I think politically diet question in particular is a very sensitive one, and I dare say I've been to many COPs. I wouldn't imagine that necessarily being a topic that is ever effectively negotiated. But what I wanted to highlight interestingly, even politically at the national level, this is considered a very difficult question, issues around diet. But what we're seeing with experience of citizens' assemblies, where the random citizens are selected through lottery, like a citizens' jury duty to discuss the future of climate policy, the question of diet and food choices increasingly comes up from the citizens themselves. And that has been a surprise, for example, in Scotland and in many other national assemblies where it did come up for politicians, that actually citizens are thinking about that once presented with the evidence on climate change. And so I think in the future, we would probably see more measures coming on that at the country level, or maybe rather at the regional level, at the city level. And we're already seeing some signs of citizens pushing for this to come on the political agenda.
Thank you, Alina. And then next turn.
I think it's very important to see agriculture as a system, obviously, with supply side and demand side. I just have a very quick word on the demand side in a moment, but on the supply side, we have in world agriculture about $700 billion a year of agricultural subsidies. And what do we get? We get degraded land, poisoned rivers, and destroyed forests. I'm not suggesting that we should have less agricultural subsidy. I am suggesting that we should have agricultural subsidies and incentive structures which deliver very different results. And that destruction of the environment associated with the way the system operates at the moment is responsible, as others have said, for a lot of emissions and for a lot of lack of resilience. And that, I think, is something where we have to be very clear. We talk a lot about reframing our cities, and rightly so, and our energy and our transport. We have to also talk a great deal about reforming a whole system of agriculture. There's a great deal that we can do, and I think that discussions around climate and COP should help us in pushing forward on something that we should have been doing anyway, even if we'd never heard of climate change. So that's a very important public policy question. And when I was chief economist of the World Bank 20 years ago, when I suggested what I've just said, I was denounced by two commissioners who asked for the president of the World Bank to find another chief economist. And I pointed out that the average cow got a $2 a day subsidy, when in fact much of the poor people in the world were living on less than $2 a day. So there's a huge amount that we can do on the supply side. And to be fair, in the last 20 years, the Common Agricultural Policy has indeed changed quite a lot, but further to go. But it's not the only place, far from it, where this problem arises. So we have to look at the supply side, and it's a very big deal. We waste so much, probably 30% of food production in different ways in different places, but that's ballpark across the world. There's huge amounts we can do. On the demand side, it has to be public information and public discussion so that people understand the consequences of what they do. You can't tell people what to eat, but you can have a public discussion of the pros and cons of different forms of food consumption, including for health, of course. And I think that's going to move quite strongly under the Indian G20 presidency. Prime Minister Modi has launched a movement, Lifestyle for the Environment. I was involved in the launch earlier this year and participated in COP27 on that, on how that's going forward. We're going to hear much more of it under India's G20 presidency, and rightly so.
Thank you very much. Nick Robbins, I think did you want to add something?
Yeah, just to highlight, I think this issue of food and the transformation of the food system, I think is certainly something that investors are really increasingly thinking about, and particularly thinking about particularly beef production as being maybe the next stranded asset after fossil fuels. And therefore, I think there's some beginnings of an agenda about how we think about the reduction of animal agriculture, and think of that again in this sort of just transition framing, where we're thinking about actually, as we make these changes, how we considering rural communities, and also how consumers are brought into those decisions. But it's certainly rising up the investment agenda. This sort of food system alongside energy system transformation is going to be a big thing for the next year, I think.
Thank you very much, Nick. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question. And James McKay, Doctoral Training Centre Manager at the University of Leeds. COP26 and COP27 seem to have been captured by the fossil fuel lobby, with far more present from these groups than previously. What is the panelists' sense of this influence? So, who wants to pick this one up? Mara, do you want to give an impression? I mean, when you were at COP, were you kind of surprised by the level of presence of the fossil fuel industry, both state-owned and companies?
Yes, it was chilling to see the numbers, to know that there were 600 participants from the fossil fuel industry and other lobbyists, and especially knowing how difficult it is for young people to participate in order to get states to commit to stopping any new fossil fuel, to see such a strong presence going in the opposite direction is saddening. So yes, indeed, I think it shows where the resources are, and I think it proves that participation at COP should maybe be monitored in a different way, and access to this sort of platform and to the venue should be somehow regulated differently, in accordance with the purposes of the COP and the UNFCCC.
Thank you, Mara. And Alison, you did mention that that the UK have been pressing hard for language to be extended to all fossil fuels as well as coal, and that we ended up with some rather weaker language. I don't know if you want to add anything on this issue of the influence of the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah, happy to. So sometimes I think when you're negotiating at COP, you're in a bit of a bunker and you don't necessarily see the kind of broader things that are happening around. So I read the same as everybody else on the numbers. I mean, I guess all I would say is we did push hard with a number of countries to get fossil fuel language into the text, and it never appeared there. From my perspective, the expectation would be when you have that number of countries pushing for something, it appears there, and then it might not end there, but at least you acknowledge the push that has been made. So that didn't happen, and I guess it's for the COP27 presidency to explain why. I know that COP26 was also in the question. I mean, I would say, for the things that we could control, things like sponsorship, we had very strict criteria about who could be involved. And certainly we didn't come under any direct pressure from the fossil fuel industry at our COP, but as also been mentioned in the question, there are plenty of kind of on a more national level states that have a big interest in fossil fuels, and you also obviously see the influence of those in the outcomes that we're able to achieve as well.
Thank you, Alison. Nick Robbins.
Yeah, a couple of things. One is actually was a comment to me by a energy utility, which is almost completely phased out fossil fuels, and they were included in this list of the 600. And so they've made a large transition, almost phased out, almost completely renewables. And so they felt a little bit upset that actually they were included as a fossil fuel lobbyist. And I think there'll be a number of companies which are making that transition. I mean, maybe one of the things is we should think about this on an evidence base. We now do have the high-level expert group on net zero, the recommendations around what constitutes a credible transition plan. We have great initiatives such as the Transition Pathway Initiative at the LSE, grading companies' plans and commitments. And maybe there should be some form of assessment about the participation of fossil fuel companies about do they have credible net zero plans? Are they moving away from fossil fuels? Are they moving towards clean energy on a pathway that's required? So that perhaps you could do some selection on that basis to show those companies who are genuinely committed to a transition, obviously that they can be involved and participate in the debates. Thank you.
Mara, did you want to come back?
Very briefly, just I wanted to recognize the fact that the youth movement has been one of the only ones to be brave enough to actually take the streets of the venue and protest and send clear messages against fossil fuels and for keeping 1.5 alive. I think that was extraordinary, especially under the circumstances of the COP27 taking place in Egypt.
Thank you very much. And Timo and then Alina.
Yeah, thank you. Very briefly, I mean, the key influence doesn't happen at the COP, but beforehand in the ministry. So it's not the case that the lobbyists would be sitting around the table. It's they're influencing the governments which negotiate. So even if we would ban all fossil fuel lobbyists, that doesn't mean that suddenly we would reach higher ambition levels. In fact, many negotiation teams from Arab countries are sitting in the petroleum ministry. So this is telling us something. So I personally would very much support that call, but this doesn't mean, so it's not the case that these fossil fuel companies would be sitting on the table, it's countries negotiating.
Thank you, Timo and Alina. So you're on mute, Alina.
I think this is a very important theme, which actually links to a broader question of integrity around climate action. And I wanted to mention that Grantham Research Institute, currently in partnership with DLA Piper, is working on a project looking at integrity risks around climate action. And that would include undue influence, corruption, and the related matters. And actually at this COP, we hosted 2 closed-door roundtables with organizations working on these issues. And there was a very strong recognition that this is long overdue, and we really need to put more emphasis on how to nudge and kind of mainstream climate-related risks into the organizations that work on integrity and corruption. And this is something we will be focusing on, the litigation team in particular at the Institute going forward.
Thank you. I just want to move on and just very quickly deal with one more question because we're nearly out of time. We have a question from Maria Nazarova Doyle. She says, I read that the agreement to come back with updated NDCs annually, I mean, has actually reversed back to every 5 years. Is that not the case? And if so, how is this enforced? There's only a few countries updated there since Glasgow. So Alison, perhaps you could clarify. Of course, the Paris introduced a kind of the countries come back every 5 years with revised, more ambitious pledges. Then in Glasgow, we had the come back next year because you're not aligned with 1.5. And then that language seemed to have kind of disappeared a little bit from the COP27 outcome. So could you briefly kind of just deal with that? How often are countries supposed to come back with revised pledges now?
Yeah, sure. So actually the request to come back with updated NDCs was repeated in exactly the same way that it was in Glasgow, but with 2023 as the deadline. So there's a very clear push for increased 2030 ambition and for that to happen next year. We thought that was one of the most important outcomes of Glasgow, because if we had just kind of carried on with the 5-year cycle of the Paris Agreement, the next thing we'd be looking at would be 2035 NDCs, and we would have lost the ability to press on 2030 ambition. So I think that was important. That was one of the key things that we pushed for, and it was one of the major things that we saw reflected in the Sharm el-Sheikh text that we had wanted carried forward from Glasgow. And now the key will be to, encouraging all of the major emitters to actually heed that call, because there are still some who haven't increased their ambition or only marginally done so since Paris, and they really now have to step up, and we'll be continuing to press for that.
Very good. Well, an appropriate way, I think, to end this session, focusing on the need for all countries over the next 12 months to come back with more ambitious pledges before COP28. I want to thank everyone. I want to thank each of the panelists, Alison Campbell, Timo Leiter, Nick Stern, Nick Robbins, Alina Averchenkova, and Mara Gillan. Thank you very much for your expert insight. Thank you to all the audience for their questions and engagement. And also thank you to Alison Peacock and Alex Burrows for having done all the hard work of organizing this. Please do keep an eye on the Grantham Research website for future events. We will no doubt have a post-COP event after COP28 next year, but hopefully we will see progress in the year ahead. And thank you all again very much for participating, and goodbye.